on.
Oh, okay, that's great. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Thanks very much for inviting me, Muhammad. Thanks for introducing me, Saif. I actually met Saif right after I became Muslim in 1997, fall of 1997. He looks very similar to the way he did when I first met him. I also want you to all not only appreciate Brother Muhammad, but also I want you to try, some of you at least, to try and be like him, because if we don't have people who really do a good job of kind of engaging with young people and helping them come together and making them feel happy and comfortable when they come together, then I'm not sure how well the Muslim community is going to do. You have to, if you want to have another generation of Muslims, and after that another generation of Muslims, you have to have people who are excited, happy to come to the mosque, and excited and happy to be around other Muslims and who see other Muslims and Muslim life as their main way of existing. So it's very important, and I'm really appreciative of him. Every time I see him, it makes me really happy. And not just personally, but it makes me optimistic. So I want some of you, whether men or women, guys or girls, to really think about being more active in helping bring other people together. One thing I learned relatively early on as a Muslim, maybe in the early 2000s, was you don't choose. Becoming a leader isn't a big deal. I mean, it's not something you sort of think about, like, I'm going to become a leader. You have the chance to become a leader when anyone else looks to you for help, when anyone else looks to you to make them feel better or to teach them. And it doesn't mean you have to be the greatest or most knowledgeable person in the world. It just means you have to step up and help those around you. So I want you to always think about that you may already have been called upon to be a leader, and you will constantly be called upon to be a leader. And that's because you're in a community that's embattled and besieged, and has a lot of pressures on it, especially young people like you. Some of you maybe were born even after 9/11. Your whole lives you've lived in a pressure cooker where your religion has been attacked constantly. And that's not natural. You can't grow up like that without it taking a toll on you. So I want you to think about helping other people. When you help other people, you help yourself. Right? Ansurullah yansurkum, right? So come to the aid of God. Come to the aid of God's community, God will come to your aid. All right. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question, just to start out. How many of you think slavery is wrong? Good. And how many of you, the rest of you, are liars? I mean, you're not liars, you're just embarrassed. If you live in the United States and you're not in the South, maybe, I don't know. If you lived in urban United States, you think slavery is wrong. You've actually never had a choice, but you've been raised to have this feeling. Let me ask you a question, and this is potentially offensive, but I usually use another example, and I'm tired of using it, so this one might be slightly offensive, but I'm going to do it anyway. Who's this, Lizzo? Rizzo or Lizzo? Lizzo? Rizzo? Lizzo. She's a singer?
Yeah.
Okay. There's a big controversy around Lizzo. What's the controversy, as far as I can tell? As far as I can tell, the controversy around Lizzo is that Lizzo is extremely overweight. Correct?
Yes. Okay.
And then, but she is like, performs in skimpy clothing or something. So there's a lot of stuff around, like, is Lizzo really, should she really be up there, you know? That's as far as I can tell. Why is this controversy? Why is there this controversy?
People don't like saying it.
Well, I have a question. I mean, when you go to movies and you watch movies and there's a romantic lead in the movie, female lead, does that person ever look like Lizzo? Does that person ever look anything like Lizzo? Does that person ever look anything like Lizzo? No. Oh, here's another thing. Let's say there is an African-American female romantic lead. What does her hair look like? Does it look like, poofy afro hair. Is that the correct term? Does it? I have a question. Why do movie studios choose who's going to be in movies, right? But I mean, yeah, they're bad, they're awful, they're media, et cetera, they're materialistic Hollywood. But let's be fair. Is it really their fault? Let's say they picked they put Lizzo in the romantic comedy lead and had her natural hair, right? What would happen? Would people go to the movie? Would people find this believable?
No.
Yeah, I mean, come on, guys. Come on, people. Give me a break. Listen, I keep it real, okay? You got to keep, I'm not saying what should be the case. I'm asking you to tell me about your society. You're part of the society. You can tell me. Because if you take a random American dude, who probably is white just because they're the majority, right? And you say, do you want to go watch a, for our society, overweight woman with natural African hair in a movie? They're going to say no. So do you want to watch, like, who's attractive? Blake, the wife of Ryan, what's his face? Ryan Reynolds. Blake Lively. Do you want to go see Blake Lively in a movie? They say, yeah, okay, I'll see Blake Lively. That's fine. Yeah. Now, and you can tell them, you can sit that white guy down, you can say, you're a bad person, white guy. You're racist. And you're ableist. What's like the ableist, but you're against overweight people? Is that ableist? Fattest? You're fattest. You're racist and you're fattest. And you can sit there and you can lecture that guy all day long and tell him he's a bad person. And he's going to say, what is he going to say? Look, I don't know what to tell you. Like, when I see Blake Lively in a movie, it interests me sexually. When I see Lizzo in the movie, it doesn't interest me sexually. What do you want me to do? I can't control this. How many of you, ladies, how many of you have yelled at some guy you know, maybe male relative, you say, why do you like that girl? I introduced you to her. She's amazing. She's wonderful. You should marry her. And your guy friend / brother / cousin says, I don't know, man. There's nothing that guy can do. I know you're angry at him. There's nothing he can do. That's natural, right? When we talk about what you're attracted to, it doesn't get more natural than that, does it? Does anyone understand what I'm talking about? That's natural. But guess what? That's not natural at all. I mean, if we think about natural as somehow inborn in the species of human beings or in some animal, what? If you lived 200 years ago, has anyone ever seen the movie? Oh, you guys go back and watch this. The South African television series Shaka Zulu, made in the 1980s. Who saw that? It's a pro-apartheid, but it's pro-apartheid in a subtle way. You can still enjoy it. You saw Shaka Zulu. You saw Shaka Zulu. Who else saw Shaka Zulu? Nobody else? Okay. So the African king is in Zululand at that time. Who are they surrounded by? Were they surrounded by skinny, who's that person who was in Django Unchained? The woman. Kelly Washington. Kerry Washington? Kerry Washington? Yeah. Correct? Okay. Are they surrounded by Kerry Washington hotties? They're surrounded by people who look exactly like Lizzo. In fact, Lizzo's actually a little thin, to be honest. Lizzo's not hot enough for those kings. They want someone who's really big. Because if you're rich and you're powerful, that means you can eat as much as you want. Because everyone else is starving, right? So wealth is shown through being fat. That's why you go to the National Art Gallery. Look at these pictures of the 1700s, women lounging in the harem and stuff like that. They're always like, ladies needs to lose some weight. Because back then, that was the female ideal of beauty. I don't need to explain this to you. You know this already. Ideals of beauty change over time. And what are they shaped by? They're not shaped by nature. They're shaped by economic forces. What do I mean by that? What is attractive today? Guys, beautiful woman, is she going to have dark skin or is she going to have white skin? White. She has white skin. Why does she have to have white skin? Because white skin means you're not outside working. You get to stay inside all the time. you're rich. Nowadays, are we interested in someone with like super white skin, like pasty ass white skin? No. We want someone who's tan. Why? Tan means you have luxury to go to the beach and sun yourself, or you're rich enough to have a tanning bed. So whatever indicates, and by the way, is someone who's overweight today, doesn't mean they're rich, it means they're poor. Why? They don't have time to exercise. They don't have enough money to buy good food. They can't go to Whole Foods. They have to go to Kmart, not Kmart, not even Walmart, 7-Eleven, like they buy, they eat Cheetos instead of meals, right? If they live in a food desert. So today, beauty is 100 years ago, and you guys, probably some of you live in families where this is still the case, where you bring this girl and you say, isn't she beautiful? And they say, she's all skin and bones. You need to fatten her up, right? I'm not judging anything. These are not moral judgments. Standards of beauty are shaped by economic factors. But they feel natural. That's why my point to you is they feel natural. Understanding the way that Muslims should think about morality doesn't mean being a moral relativist. It doesn't mean you don't care about what people think around you. It means understanding that human beings are actually a lot more diverse than we think of them today. They're more diverse in the world today, and they're more diverse in history. And what's right and what's wrong can be different in different times and different places. Even if those things feel unnatural to you. Do you all understand? Does anyone have any questions about what I just said, or concerns or confusion? No? Okay. So when I asked you, do you think slavery is wrong? And you all raised your hands. This is not a debate. We can't have a debate about whether slavery is wrong. That's like debating whether the sky is blue. Of course it's wrong. If you live in America, of course you think it's wrong. Most people in the world today, almost all people in the world today, will think it's wrong. And they won't just think it's wrong because they're trying to look good. They'll think it's wrong because deep down in their gut, they think it's wrong. What we're going to talk about today is, how do we understand why you have that feeling? And what's the crisis here? It's the same crisis we think about when we think about the Prophet ﷺ marrying Aisha. Or when we think about the fact that some Muslims are polygamous, that they're allowed to be polygamous. And a lot of women might say, I think that's absolutely wrong. Wait, so you think it's absolutely wrong what the Prophet did, and what the companions did, and what the Quran allowed, and what Muslims did for centuries in some places? Because how do we understand the difference between what we feel and what our religion has in it? That's the big question we're asking today. And I hope that you will be satisfied with the answer by the time we finish, inshallah. Okay? So I'm just going to read you, these are just some very short passages from different texts. This is from two British travelers in what's now northern Nigeria in the 1820s. Okay? The house was in charge of one Bagirmi slave. So Bagirmi is an area near Lake Chad. Everyone knows where Lake Chad is? Everyone knows where Chad is? It's in Chad. It's maybe 1 or 2 countries over from Nigeria now. One Bagirmi slave who had been 24 years in bondage. He was pleased greatly when he found out that I had been near his home, and the names of some of the towns made him clap his hands with pleasure. But when I asked him whether he should like to return, he answered, No, I'm better where I am. I have no home now but this one. And what will my master's children do without me? He is dead, and his son is dead. And who will take care of the gardens for his wives and his daughters if Musa goes? No, Musa is still a slave, and so much the better for him. His country is far off and full of enemies. Here I have a house and plenty to eat, thank God. And 2 months ago they gave me a wife and kept my wedding and made my wedding go for 8 days. So these British guys are saying, basically, we want to try and help you escape. And he says, no, I've been here, this is my home. Who's going to take care of it without me? And I just got married too. All right. The next section is from Ibn Hazm. Ibn Hazm is a famous scholar. He died in 1064 Common Era, 456 Hijri. He's from what's now Spain. He wrote a book on love called The Ring of the Dove, Tawq al-Hamama. He says, a trustworthy woman told me that she had seen in the house of Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Wahab, known as Al-Raqiza, of the sons of the Banu Dakhil tribe. And this woman came with, this woman was in that family, a slave girl, very charming and pretty, who had a master whom death suddenly took away. So her master suddenly died. And she was sold with his estate, and she refused to consent to have intercourse with men after him. And no man had intercourse with her until she met God most exalted and high. She was very skillful in singing, but she denied her knowledge of it, and rather preferred to be a servant and to abstain from joining with the groups of women who go in for having children and pleasure and a good situation, out of her loyalty to the one who had been hidden in a shroud and put in the ground, right? So her master dies. She had been his concubine, and then she basically refused to be with any man after that until she died. She refused children and everything. The last example, I won't read you directly, but it's from the letters of a British woman, an English woman named Lady Wortley Montagu. She died in the mid-1700s, and she was the wife of the British ambassador to Constantinople, Istanbul, in the early 1700s. And she has, I recommend reading these letters. There's about 100 or 200 pages of them, which just she wrote from Istanbul, and she spent a lot of time with the women in Ottoman capital, which is really interesting because she goes inside the harems and talks to women, and she's a very good analyst and really accurate describer of what she sees, and very honest. And she, by the way, brings the science of vaccination against smallpox, which the Ottomans did. She brought that to England and introduced it to England. So she talks about a Venetian woman she met, who was one of the wealthiest women in Istanbul, a Venetian woman, she was Christian. She had been captured when she was a young woman with her family. She'd been captured by an Ottoman admiral. And the Ottoman admiral had let her family go, but had kept her as his concubine, right? Then her brother, a couple of years, her brother comes back and says, we want to ransom my sister back from you. And the woman describes what she thought about. She thought, look, if I go back now, I'm going to get put in a convent, right? Because I'm like a fallen woman. I've had sex with this guy. I'm not, I'm kind of a disgraced woman. They're going to put me in a convent. I'm going to live as a nun for the rest of my life. Here, she actually says my husband's my master's very good looking. He's very generous. He's very loving to me. And she elects to stay with him. And she stays with him until eventually he dies. And he leaves her one of the wealthiest widows in Constantinople, in Istanbul, one of the wealthiest women. I introduced these examples to show you, I'm not arguing that slaves want to be slaves or something. What I'm arguing is that humans have all sorts of experiences. All sorts of, the breadth of human experience is so massive. People can want lots of different things. And if you're thinking, some of you might have thought, well, Professor Brown, you're reading us these stories about this guy who wanted to stay a slave in northern Nigeria, or this woman who wanted to stay with her, who didn't want to be with any other man after her master died, or this woman who stayed in Istanbul and didn't want to go back to Venice. Well, who gave anyone the right to take them away in the first place? Surely they would have preferred never to have been enslaved. That's true. But do you know what one of the main sources of slavery in human history is? That's one of them. It's probably not the biggest. You know what the biggest one is? Probably? Debt. Debt. You fall into debt, you become a slave to the person you can't pay back. But even more, well, probably around that. It's hard to say when you're talking about such vast time and space, but selling your kids. Selling your children into slavery. Not just your children. Chieftains or kings or lords selling their subjects into slavery to make money. If you're a parent selling your child into slavery, not necessarily because you want to make money, but sometimes because you can't feed your child. And you just want someone else to take care of them. So lots of times in human history, people have been sold into what we call slavery, or have entered what we call slavery, not because someone decided it was their right to do that to them, but because their own parent or their own leader put them into that situation. Sometimes, by the way, they voluntarily became a slave. And if you want to know an example of this, you can just read in the Old Testament in the book of Deuteronomy, where it tells the Hebrews what to do when someone wants to do this. You have to go and you have to do this symbolic act of attaching their ear to the door with like piercing their ear to the door of the house. They don't stay like that, but it's just a symbolic act when they want to become like they want to become your slave for life. Why would people voluntarily become slaves? Because it's better than the other option. Who here saw Mad Max Fury Road? Only one person? 2 people? Jeez, you guys, this is an amazing film. You should watch it. Really fascinating film. If you could, what would you rather do? Live in like the desert, eating, I don't know what, lizards? Or living in that citadel where it's green and there's water and stuff like that? And if someone said, you need to become a slave to the lord of the citadel in order to live there, you'd be like, okay, that's better than dying of starvation. So we think about these, we might say this isn't a serious statement. That's because we all live in tremendous luxury. How many people have gone a month without bathing? Who here has gone a month without bathing? Safe? No, but that's your normal lifestyle. I'm talking about. Has anyone here gone a month without bathing? Has anyone here gone a week without bathing? If you went a week without bathing, how would you feel? Would you feel disgusting? If you encountered someone else who had gone a week without bathing or a month without bathing, would you judge them? Would you look down on them? Yeah, you would. I mean, you might correct yourself, but your initial instinct would be, oh. Is this a moral issue? This is simply a matter of wealth. Lots of people in human history and lots of people today don't get to bathe. And it's not because they're not good people or because they're bad people or because their culture is bad or dirty. They just don't have access to water or a heater or the time. Again, so much of what we think of as moral is actually economic. So much what we think about as economic actually has a moral impact on us. So I want to start out with these 3 examples of how complicated human life can be. These are 3 examples. I could read you 3 cases of people who are miserable being slaves. Of course, I could read you 10 cases of people who are miserable being slaves. I chose to read these 3 to you because they show us an aspect that we usually don't think about. But it's just as much an aspect of human life and of human history as people who are miserable and oppressed. Okay. This issue of slavery is very hard to talk about. It's very hard to talk about in the United States. It's very hard to talk about, I'd say, in the modern world. It's certainly very hard to talk about in the modern West. I think it's equally difficult to talk about in a lot of Muslim countries. I've had a lot of tense conversations about this, even in places like Istanbul or Cairo. But especially in the United States, it's very difficult because of what I call the slavery conundrum. Slavery conundrum. Slavery conundrum is, who remembers the Charlottesville protests? Was it 2-3 years ago now? Remember that in the summer? It was in August of 2017, I believe. And so there was this, at University of Virginia, there's a statue of Thomas Jefferson, who founded the university. And protesters, sort of liberal, let's call them woke activists, wanted to take down the statue, wanted the statue taken down. Why do they want to take it down? What do they have against Thomas Jefferson? Anybody? He's a slave owner, not just that. He had children with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, right? So the guy who wrote, all men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was having had a bunch of slaves and had kids with one of his slaves. And those children were also slaves until they were eventually freed. So then Donald Trump came out and gave a speech. And actually, he said something really profound. He said it in a way only he could manage. Hey, Kyle. Assalamu alaikum. Kyle read my whole book before it was published. He was a very helpful reader. What did Donald Trump say? He said, George Washington had slaves. You're going to take down statues of George Washington? You know how there's an effort to rename highways like the Highway Route 1, I think it used to be called Robert E. Lee Highway or something. They just renamed 29. No, but 29, they didn't rename Lee Highway. No. But there's the section of Route 1 in Virginia, I think they renamed. Maybe it's called Jefferson Davis Highway, yeah. So there's this idea we need to rename things that are named after slave owners. If George Washington's a slave owner and you renamed everything in the United States that was named after George Washington, I mean, first of all, it'd be a big deal. Second of all, it's impossible. Why is it impossible? Why would that be essentially impossible? Because Americans were like, what the hell are you talking about? George Washington was a great guy.
Because you can't change the history.
Well, you can't change history, but you can judge history. Here's the slavery conundrum. I asked you, is slavery wrong? You said yes. So let me ask you a question. Let's say there's some slavery that's good, right? Some slavery is okay, and there's some slavery that's bad. No? It's all bad, right? It's all bad? So this is the slavery conundrum. One is that we have three beliefs in our society that you have to have. But they cannot all be held at the same time. There is a contradiction between them. The first one is that slavery is a gross and intrinsic evil. What does that mean, gross? Gross evil means it's a serious evil. So when people talk about slavery, they talk about slavery as like one of history's greatest crimes. And it's intrinsic. So there's not, slavery is evil in and of itself. It's not evil when it's done badly. It's not evil when it's excessive. It's intrinsically evil. So was slavery evil during the time of Thomas Jefferson? Yes. Was slavery evil 100 years before Thomas Jefferson? Yes. Was slavery evil 1,000 years ago? Yes. These are beliefs that we hold in our society. So it's a gross evil. You can't say like, this thing is bad, but it's not that bad. No, this is like inexcusable. You can never accept it. And it's in and of itself bad, no matter where and when. That's belief number one. Belief number two is that all slavery is slavery. There's no good and bad slavery. You can't say like, just imagine you go into like a party at work and someone's talking about slavery. You're like, yeah, but that's okay slavery. What would happen to you in that work conversation? Just imagine. You'd be like hounded out of there. The third belief we have is that our past has some moral or even legal authority over us. Why do we care about George Washington? Why do we care about Thomas Jefferson? Why do they matter? They matter because people believe their ideas and their personas have authority over us. We respect them. We revere them. They lead us. They guide us. But where's the contradiction? If slavery is a gross and intrinsic evil in all places and all times, and if there's no such thing as good slavery and bad slavery, there's just slavery, then anybody who was involved in slavery or approved it or had slaves, was complicit or guilty of a gross and intrinsic evil across space and time. So how can that person then be someone you seek moral advice from? Imagine this. Imagine there's a politician in America who comes up and says, who's like the most popular politician in this room? Are you guys like Bernie fans or Buttigieg fans? Or Bernie. Okay, you guys are Bernie fans. Those of you who are not Bernie fans, pretend you're Bernie fans for a moment, okay? Imagine Bernie Sanders, it's like, I'm here, I'm Bernie, I got all these great ideas, but I gotta say, I think slavery's okay. Is Bernie gonna make it in American political life? If you got up and said you think slavery is okay, you would be shown out the door immediately. You would not be allowed in public life. And yet, you would look for leadership to people who not only thought it was okay, but had slaves themselves. Here's the problem. Essentially nobody, and by I mean nobody, I mean like I've counted I think 3 or 4 people that we know of in world history. People, not 3 or 4 groups. I mean 3 or 4 people that I've counted in world history before the late 1600s who thought that slavery in and of itself was wrong. So whatever religion, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy, Platonic philosophy, Stoic philosophy, etc. Whatever philosophy, philosophical system you want, none of these held that slavery was an gross and intrinsic evil in and of itself. So if you were going to apply these 2 principles, that slavery is a gross and intrinsic evil across space and time, and that all slavery is slavery and evil, you would basically be saying that all of humanity's moral and religious heritage prior to the 1600s should just be thrown into the garbage can. Now, if that's what you want to do, that's fine. But most people are not going to accept that, right? Just like most Americans aren't going to accept saying, I'm not going to call Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. anymore because George Washington was a slave owner. Do you have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Could it be that by 1600, the definition of slavery itself, with chattel slavery, transatlantic slave trade, and the creation of race as an idea, that's when people are actually having serious debates in the Vatican about...
I have a question. Yeah, fine. I understand your question, but...
Native Americans are human or not. That.
Here's the debate. Does slavery have to be racist to be wrong? Does it have to be based on race to be wrong?
No, I'm just saying, at that era, slavery takes a whole different... It becomes a global trade.
Yeah.
And it manufactures race. It puts certain people in a lower place. No one was debating who's human and who's not, and that would justify enslaving them before that point.
Okay, yeah, so and that's a good point, right? But people, of course, had lots of debates about who's human and who's not, and have looked upon other groups as inferior or not deserving of the same rights. So that's certainly part of what really shocks a lot of like Enlightenment European thinkers, and by European also American thinkers. That a lot of them are shocked by the racial justification for slavery in the 1600s and 1700s. But we'll discuss there's other stuff going on as well. I have a question. Why does the slavery conundrum exist? Does everyone understand the slavery conundrum? That's why, by the way, it's very difficult to have conversations about this. If you start talking to people about this, and I've talked to lots of people about this, they will pretty quickly get extremely upset. And they won't just get upset because it's a painful topic, it's a difficult topic. They'll get upset because their brain stops, you can't compute, does not compute at a certain point. If you say, look, for example, why did some of the apostles follow Jesus in Christianity? Why did some of them have slaves? Why didn't Jesus condemn slavery? Why did the Christian church allow slavery? Why did St. Augustine say it's fine? Why did all these? Why? Why did St. Thomas Aquinas accept slavery as natural? Well, they didn't know it was wrong at the time. Okay, so what you're telling me is they didn't know, but you do know, right? So why do you pay attention to what they said? I mean, would you pay attention to somebody, would you take moral advice or legal advice from somebody who didn't know slavery was wrong? Who didn't know what like 5- and 6-year-olds today know? People are in a choice, faced with a choice of condemning their past or saying that those people in the past were actually aware that maybe slavery wasn't wrong for them. But if it's not wrong for them, then slavery can't be wrong across space and time. It's just wrong at a certain time. But then when does that time start? When did slavery start being wrong? How do you explain that? So this is very uncomfortable for people to think about. The reason this slavery conundrum exists is actually a feature of, or a result of, abolitionist discourse, the abolitionist movement in Britain and in the United States in the 18th century, especially the late 1700s, very late 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. If you're an abolitionist activist, you're trying to end slavery. You go and you start talking to the Southern slave owner. You say, hey, Southern slave owner, slavery is bad. You need to get rid of slavery. And he says, hey, look at my slaves. They're happy. I'm teaching them Christianity. I'm teaching them how to read. They retire. They're taken care of. What do you have to complain about? And by the way, look at your industrial workers in the North. They're miserable. I mean, these guys seem to be happier than your industrial workers. The only way you can win this argument is by saying, no, slavery itself, that very category itself, the phenomenon itself is intrinsically evil. And there can never be a situation where there's happy slaves and their slavery becomes okay. You have to condemn it. You have to end the negotiation, because that's actually how slavery survived in a lot of places, like say British India and parts of British Africa and French Africa or Dutch Southeast Asia. It survived because people said, hey, slaves here are actually okay. It's not like slavery in the Caribbean or slavery in the Americas. So abolitionists realized that if they started getting negotiations about good slavery and bad slavery, that it would be used as a device to extend the institution of slavery in other places. So you have to, the only way you can end it as a phenomenon in the world is to have this like really black and white logic. Slavery is evil in all types and all shapes and all kinds. It was always evil. It needs to be gotten rid of completely. Okay. But this leaves us kind of a weird situation, because we've been talking about slavery this whole time. But how do we know what slavery is? And we've been talking. Let's say you're someone like Benjamin Rush, one of the founding fathers, who's very anti-slavery, who's a fierce abolitionist activist. You're committed to ending slavery. What are you committed to ending?
That you don't control the destiny of a human being.
Really? Okay, you don't control the destiny of a human being.
My mother delivered me as a free person.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody has the right to.
So your mother didn't control your destiny? You're a Muslim, right?
Right.
You're not a Hindu. Your mother could have raised you as a Hindu. Wouldn't that have controlled your destiny? If someone keeps you in a life of poverty, aren't they controlling your destiny, even if you're technically free? So here's the question is, if you're an abolitionist activist in the 1800s, and you say, I want to go and I want to end slavery everywhere, how are you going to find it? What are you going to look for? Yes?
Is it like a transactional exchange of humans?
Transactional exchange of humans. So like when I got married, right? I gave my wife a mahar. Okay, I gave my wife the mahar, fine. But in other societies, let's say India, the wife's family gives mahar to the husband's family. They have to pay them to take their daughter off their hands. I don't know, that's how I see it. I don't want to judge, right? But so, or, you know,
Even in parts of Pakistan, that's the tradition.
I've got all these workers, and you're going to take them, and they're going to live with you, and they're going to work on your railroad or something like that, and you're going to pay me for that. So yeah, there's a transaction, but here's the question. A lot of people look at Islamic marriage and say, oh, what's this mahar? Is this like you guys are paying for marriage? Ew, that's gross. That's not romantic. I mean, so lots of people in human history have engaged in relationships that we don't think of as in the United States as being as transactional, but they're actually totally transactional. I mean, even to this day, you know, if you really get down to the nuts and bolts of what marriage is, And, you see families who are like, trying to make ends meet, and wife dumps her husband because he's not putting bread on the table. At the end of the day, he's got to perform. If he can't bring home the bacon, he's got to go.
I guess because all the examples that you're bringing up are assuming to be consensual.
Okay, so you might be looking for, let's say you're going to look for transaction. Okay, transaction, because slavery is treating humans like property.
Right.
So that's one major definition of slavery is humans as property. This goes all the way back to Aristotle, the idea of humans as property. And you also see this in the Quran, right? The Quran talks about Abdun Mamluk, a slave who's owned. Let's talk about the other thing you said is consent. Okay, maybe somebody wants to be in this situation, so we accept it. What about women who want to be in polygamous marriages? Maybe we're Muslims, we are okay with that, but how do a lot of people see that? Or yeah, look at you, you're wearing hijab. But I know you don't want to do that. You want to be like, you want to be free. You want to be like American women. You're being forced to do it by your patriarchal environment because you're brainwashed. I just need to free you from that. So here's the problem. If you decide you know what people want more than what they want, their consent doesn't matter. Right? But that's actually not answering your direct question. The direct question is, you're going to look for situations people are not, they said, I don't want to be in this situation. Then you say, okay, this is slavery. This person doesn't want to be in that situation. Here's a question. Lots of us don't want to be in situations that we're in, and no one's coming and liberating us. So there's lots of people in America like, I don't want to work at McDonald's. I don't want to be poor. Why aren't they being liberated? Well, they chose that. They chose to work. Really? Did people choose to work in like menial labor positions? So the question here is, how do you measure consent? I mean, to what extent do people really have choices in their lives? How do you decide the difference between what you're going to try and get rid of, which is slavery, and someone else who's just in a position they don't like being in, and they've been forced into that by their situation? And here's another thing. Imagine somebody's really poor and miserable, and they don't want to be in that situation, so they consensually make themselves the property of another person because that person is going to take care of them. Now you're going to be in a situation where you're saying, I'm going to get rid of this because this is property, but now you've gone against that person's will and their consensual decision and put them in a situation they don't want to be in. Does everyone understand? Okay. Then what about, so we talked about, one, you're going to look for people who are kind of being treated as property. Two, you're going to look for people who are in situations they don't consent to. Third, what's another thing? Come on, guys.
Economic.
Didn't anyone see Amistad? This is a great movie, by the way.
It's just bondage.
What does Jumanji Hansen want? He wants freedom. What does Braveheart want? You guys saw Braveheart, right? Or are you too young for that? Freedom, right? People want so you could look for people who are unfree. We could go around the world. We could look for people who are treated as property. We look for people who are, let's say, in coercive relationships, who are being coerced, and we could look for people who are unfree. Here's a problem. Besides the ones I just talked about, who can define property for me?
You can sell and pay.
Things you can buy and sell?
A possession? A possession?
Something that you so what does that mean? What does a possession mean? You have control over something.
Control over it, right? That's
Okay. So you control it, you can decide what to do with it, right?
You can sell it.
You can sell it. So what's the difference in being a slave and being someone's kid?
kids are here, brother.
No, I mean, I'm asking you seriously. So in our society, it's clear. Like, okay, I can't kill my kid, God forbid, right? I can't physically beat him really seriously. I have the right to reasonable discipline, right? I can't, but I can choose what he eats. I can choose what he believes. I can choose who he sees. I can choose how he's educated. I can choose whether I get him vaccinated or not. I can choose if I to raise him in some weird cult. I can make all these choices.
You can't sell it.
But I can't sell him. I can't hurt him too bad. So that's the difference between, in our society, we can see here, there's a difference between, let's say, possession and a child. What about pets? Who here is a pet? Okay, so I have a question. What kind of pet do you have?
Dogs.
Hey, I'm just joking. No, you're not here to make you feel bad. Okay, so let's say you have a dog. Do you love your dog?
Of course.
Would you ever kill your dog?
Definitely not.
Are you allowed to kill your dog?
Legally, no.
Illegally, you are allowed to kill your dog.
We're allowed to kill our dogs.
Yeah, and if you go, I read all the laws on animal cruelty in the United States, different states. So it depends what state you're in. Some states, as long as you don't do it in a nasty, like a vicious way where you're causing unnecessary harm, you can kill your dog. We'll just put it at that. And you're your dog's master. Your dog, I mean, the way we even think about it, that's your property. But when you think about your relationship with your dog, you don't think about these aspects. So it's interesting to think about like pets as possessions, what that means. So, but in a lot of other states, your pet is your possession, but you can't like break it like you'd break a pencil. Like a pencil's my possession, but I can't break it. I have a plant. Can I chop down a tree? In Virginia, yeah. In Maryland, maybe not, because maybe there's certain regulations about how many trees have to be in a town or in a property, and you have to get permission. So even like between two states that are right next to one another, for things that we wouldn't think about as like animals, like pets, just trees, there's different degrees of control that someone has over their property. Now, this is all in one society, in American society. But now this isn't good enough, because remember, we're abolitionists. We're trying to go and we're going to try and end slavery worldwide. What about property in other societies? So if you go to like ancient Rome, guess what? A parent can kill their child. Let's say Rome in 100 BC. A parent is allowed to kill their child. It's called patria potestas, the right of the paterfamilias, the power of the head of the family. They can kill anybody in their family. So what's the difference between child and possession in that society? So here's the problem. When we talk about slavery in world history, you can't just talk about what definition makes sense to us. Now you have to talk about a definition that's going to work all over the place. So that's property. I'll end this session in 1 second, but I just want to finish these three issues. So we talk about property, we talked about freedom. What's freedom? Tell me what freedom is.
You have the ability to do whatever you want.
Okay. Can you do whatever you want? Who said that? Good answer. I know freedom because I've watched a lot of movies. I can tell you what freedom is. Who's here saw basically any Western? Freedom is get on your horse, and you can ride onto the open range. No one's going to stop you. Right? Freedom is you can drive your car, live how you want to live, right? But actually, can we do whatever we want? Nope. We have all sorts of, forget about social pressures. The law constrains our actions. You can do whatever you want, but there might be a punishment for it. So what's freedom then? Freedom is doing whatever you're allowed that you want to do within certain limits. Okay? What's the definition of slavery then? So there's slavery and there's freedom. So what's the definition of slavery? Slavery is the opposite of freedom, correct?
When your free will is stripped.
Your free will is stripped. So let's say I'm a slave, and I do my work for the day, and then the master says, okay, you can go home and rest now. So I go home and rest. And I can sleep, or I can play cards with my friends. I can choose, right? So actually I do have free will. I just have less choices than free people. So I can still do whatever I want, just within a narrower circle. So freedom is not the opposite of slavery. Freedom and slavery are just two different degrees of limitation of your choice. Do you understand? And where that limitation is placed and how it changes is going to be based on different societies. So I'm free in America. What can I do? I can dress how I want, right? I can go, I can run with my shirt off if I'm a guy. But in other states, maybe I'm not allowed to run with my shirt off. That'd be inappropriate. In some places, women can go topless, like New York City. Other places they can't. So exactly where you draw the line between, where is the restraints on a free person or restraints on a slave is going to, again, in one society it makes sense, but the problem is it doesn't work for one society. We're trying to go across the world, and we're not just trying to go across the world, we're trying to go back in history. The third thing we talked about was coercion. Property, freedom, and coercion. How do you measure coercion? When is someone coerced?
You don't give them the choice. If you don't do this, then these are the consequences.
Okay.
The person is forced to follow the path.
So people, let's say children in schools in Britain, in England, parents have to allow their children to be taught in their sex ed class. They have to be taught now certain things about like LGBT issues and transgender stuff. And the parents have no choice. Is that coercion? Is that a fundamental right to teach your children what you think is correct about family and life and sexuality? Let's think about another situation.
Debate is who has the right to teach the children this aspect of the social behavior. Should it come from a teacher? Should it come from the parents?
I agree. This is a debate. My question is, when do we decide people are being coerced? And how much coercion do we allow? And in what areas of life?
I don't like it.
I don't like coercion either, but there's all sorts of areas in our lives where we're coerced and we don't complain. Right? We're coerced to drive under a certain speed limit. We're coerced to pay taxes. We're coerced to, some places, to keep your yard looking a certain way. We're coerced to treat our children in certain ways, or not to treat them in other ways. So my point is that how do you define where do you get one definition of coercion that you're going to go around the world and identify when is this acceptable or unacceptable? You might say, I have a certain idea where I think it's acceptable or unacceptable, and I'm going to go impose this in other places. But let's be very clear. Those other societies might not think that your definition of coercion is appropriate. So what you're really doing is imposing your beliefs on other societies. So the problem is, when we go throughout the world or throughout world history trying to identify what we think is slavery, even if we try to come up with definitions for slavery, like property, or someone who's not free, or someone who's being coerced, we're really applying our understandings of property, our understandings of freedom, our understandings of coercion. So what we're really doing is applying our definition of slavery throughout world history, which might be acceptable, but what do you do about the fact that other people have their own moralities, or other people have their own notions of freedom, their own notions of property, their own notions of coercion? Think about that just within our own Muslim families in the United States. Let's say one of our kids wants to get married to somebody, and the parents don't like them. And they say, you're not going to marry this person. And the daughter or the husband, the guy says, okay, you know what, fine, I won't. Is that person being coerced? Is that person free? A lot of people in this society would look at that person and say, that person is not free and that person is being coerced. But Other people would say, look, that's actually just them obeying their parents, and that's appropriate. Who's going to decide which is the correct view? And in that decision, aren't they engaging in what we would consider a very problematic imposition of values on other people? Okay. That was one part that we discussed. And now I think we're supposed to have, where did Muhammad go? Now they have breakout discussions?
Yes. Oh, wow. Yes.
I'm a little bit late, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're good. So, we want to break out into groups and talk about what was discussed thus far.
Can I give you guys something to think about as
Yes.
a potential issue? Are prisoners in American jails slaves? Discuss amongst yourselves. Oh, and here's another question. Were my ancestors, at least some of them, when they came here in the 1650s as indentured servants, were they slaves? Do you know what the punishment for an indentured servant fleeing in Virginia or Maryland was? Mutilation or death. Mutilation or death. You guys know what indentured service is? So I want you to ask yourself this question. Are prisoners in American jails, are they prisoners in American prisons slaves? Were indentured servants slaves?
After the abolition of slavery, like you see the massive probably as slavery was abolished, you see the prison population start coming in. So I personally was just incarcerated, basically for my food. So I went to this myself my own
But it's just the way how do you come to be in that state?
Or, you know, sign a contract to make yourself to be required to, you know, because it's very similar then to military service. The military has the right to, you know, force you to obey orders, and obey orders that would jeopardize your life. So. Yeah, you sign.
Small person incarcerated people so they can work for big corporations. Which is what's happening. Right, so it's a career. So it's kind of like you create a crime, you take that and enslave you in a sense. You know, so it's kind of great. But that's my opinion.
Yes, because it's not like I'm gonna make myself like that. It's like, oh, you committed, you actually did because you did.
True.
It should be temporary.
That's why I call it great.
Elongated. 3 strikes, you're out. Then you stay forever.
It hangs on.
Have some type of slavery. Maybe they.
What do you think? Any idea? Any idea? Okay. My second question, what I personally, I still don't, and I still can connect prisoners.
Nobody thought that black skin meant you could be enslaved. In fact, most slaves in Islamic history were Slavic or Turkic. Right? So anti-black racism exists in Islamic civilization for the same reason it exists in European civilization. Because people look down on people from sub-Saharan Africa because they were originally they were essentially vulnerable and victimized people who were, if they were brought into that society, would be in a position of servanthood. But it's interesting, just for your, sometimes you may have heard this idea that if you said like the Prophet, sometimes you say that he's black, that's like an act of kufr, to say that the Prophet is black. Some Muslim scholars say this, but they will specify that's because for most societies, at least like Northern Hemisphere societies, that's an insult. But if you were in a society where like black is beautiful or something, that wouldn't be bad. It would actually be a compliment. So you have to understand that even like scholars are very aware that there's social conventional values put on skin color that has nothing to do with like truth or falsehood or anything like that. Okay, so I'm trying to explain to you very clearly that there's no find me a Christian thinker or a Jewish thinker or a Buddhist thinker or a Confucian thinker or a Greek philosopher who said that slavery qua slavery is wrong. You just don't find it. There's one person named Gregory of Nyssa who died in 394, the Common Era. He was from Cappadocia, what's now Turkey. He had an argument. He's a Christian bishop. He said slavery is wrong because humans are created in the image of God, and it's impossible to own an image of God. Good argument. No one else, you don't see this except one guy in the 1200s, a German lawyer named, von Remke, what was his name? He wrote a book called the Saxon Spiegel, the Saxon Mirror, book of German law, earliest book of German law we have. In that he says the same thing. But he repeats this argument. I haven't seen any other instance of this at all. Then in the 1500s, you start seeing a few like Venetian and Florentine scholars saying, you know, slavery is really injurious, it causes a lot of harm. Then in the late 1600s, you see this Quaker abolitionist movement. It's really in the 1700s that you start seeing, like amongst Enlightenment thinkers, like Voltaire or Condorcet or Diderot or people like that, the idea that slavery is like it's a moral evil. And then after that, the kind of the ball really gets rolling. It really starts snowballing. But the point I'm trying to make is, a lot of times the narrative that history of abolition and the abolitionist narrative is one of what you can think about moral awakening. So it's the idea that gradually people start waking up to the moral evil of slavery. What I'm trying to tell you is, there's no moral awakening. I mean, literally everybody's snoozing. I mean, except for one or two people and one or two individuals. There's lots of condemnations of slavery prior to the 1600s, but it's slavery of other, like, you can't enslave these people, you can't enslave these people. You can't enslave Muslims, you can't enslave Christians, you can't enslave our tribe. It's not a criticism, they're not criticisms of slavery as per se or qua slavery. Now I want to ask you a question. What's happening in the 1700s and the 1800s that might explain this snowballing? I mean, this is kind of obvious when you think about it, but people don't think about it. If you were a human being and you wanted to move like a big brick or a big stone, how do you move a big stone in 1000 BC or 1000 AD or 1500 AD?
Industrial Revolution.
You get a bunch of horses or a bunch of people to pull the stone. If you want to move a big stone today, what do? You get like a excavator or a forklift or a bulldozer which burns off fossil fuel and can do it for you. It's not a coincidence that the abolitionist movement starts in northern North America, so the northern colonies become the northern United States, and Britain, two areas that had unprecedented concentrations of wealth and did so without slave labor. By the way, Americans like to complain about British oppression, but the fact of the matter is American colonies were like the fattest, most sugar-consumingest colonies. I mean, they had the rich people had, and more people had better lifestyle in North America than in almost any other place in the world at the time. They just didn't like being taxed. But it's not a coincidence that abolitionism really starts in the two places where the Industrial Revolution first takes hold and where unprecedented levels of wealth and capital then amassed without slave labor. Does everyone understand? Or it fell off? Or? And by the way, if you can go and pass a law that say that slavery is prohibited, but when we look at the end of slavery in world history from the, let's say, late 1700s until today, laws don't really take effect. I mean, the law doesn't become reality until the economy changes. If you have an economy that's reliant on human labor, until that economy changes, that labor structure won't change. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, you can't legislate. You can only legislate so much about people's rights before this economic reality like holds those laws back. They're just not is not followed. So abolition in name becomes abolition in fact when economies change. All right. And a quote which I find it's incredible, which is important to keep in mind. I think it's summarized this well. It comes from Aristotle and his Politics. Aristotle says something ingenious. He says, there will be slaves until looms, you know, looms, like things that weave cloth, until looms power themselves. It is actually correct. It's been really interesting. Okay. And oftentimes when I say this, people say, well, there's modern day slavery. We already got into that debate. As a highly politicized debate. Whether or not slavery today is really slavery or not. Okay. So we talked about the problem of defining slavery in world history. We talked about the problem of thinking about moral change and what defines morality, to what extent there's like moral realities out there in the universe versus is morality a reflection of custom and economy. By the way, saying morality is oftentimes a reflection of custom and economy is not denigrating morality. It's just acknowledging that. It's actually acknowledging a reality. So I love this example. I've used it before, but I'll use it again. If you go to restaurants in southern China, there are restaurants that just serve dog meat. That serve dog meat, and that's what they serve. People go there to eat dog meat. Now, if you gave a plate of dog meat to someone in America, they would find it morally and physically, they would physically feel sick, their stomach, and they would be morally disgusted too. Chinese people are just as human beings, just as human as Americans. They're no stupider, no less morally aware than American people are. So the things that sometimes feel the grossest or the most unnatural to you are completely natural to other people. This is custom. You read Herodotus' histories. Herodotus died around 420 BC. Quotes a line of poetry from this famous Greek poet Pindar. He says, "Custom is king of all." Custom, which is a great line. Okay. So let's talk about slavery in Islam. I want to make one other point which is important. No society that had slaves, which is most human societies, certainly every civilization and almost every society that had slaves, no society that had slaves had the idea of abolishing slavery until the early modern period. Do you understand? So until essentially the 1600s and 1700s, no society that had slaves had the idea of abolishing slavery. So this idea that somehow like there's something about Christianity or the West that doesn't like slavery, this is just not true. Christians were just as happy to have slaves and to justify slavery as anyone else. And it wasn't until economies had changed that really became an argument that anyone bought. Okay. So what the world in which Islam is revealed as a religion is a world in which slavery is a reality. It's a reality in the Near East, it's a reality in the Roman world, it's a reality everywhere, right? Something that, again, we've talked about the challenge of defining slavery worldwide. For the sake of convenience, we'll just say slavery as a world concept, even though we've already discussed, it's actually really hard to say what exactly is slavery in world history. But let's just, every society, almost every civilization, most society, that's something that we could probably make some argument as being slavery. Okay. What is it? Islam actually changes a lot of this, and this is not debated. Right? So what do I mean by that? I mean, some Orientalists can't come to me right now and say, "Oh, you're just giving a rosy vision. You're just giving an." You know, actually, everything I'm saying right now cannot be debated. I'm telling you, it cannot be debated. The Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet are obsessed with emancipation. What's the difference between emancipation and abolition? Emancipation is the idea of freeing people. Abolition is the idea of getting rid of slavery as a category or as a phenomenon. These are different. So the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet are obsessed with emancipation. In the Quran, you have the idea that, well, first of all, that believers should just free slaves. Fakku raqaba, right? That if you accidentally kill somebody, you have to free a slave. that if you break certain kinds of oaths, you have to free a slave. Or if you don't have a slave, you can fast if you can't fast. Or you
feed people.
feed 4 people, and if you can't feed people, you fast, right? Then part of your zakat, one of the groups that can receive zakat is money that goes to freeing slaves. The Quran also talks about mukataba. Mukataba is when a slave wants to buy back their own freedom on installments. That if they do that, you should agree to that. Okay? These are all mentioned in the Quran. The hadiths are so full of examples of the Prophet ﷺ ordering or recommending freeing of slaves. If someone hits their slave and causes blood to flow, the slave should be freed. If someone causes injury to the slave or mistreats him, the slave should be freed. If there's an eclipse, you should free a slave on an eclipse. If you want to assure your safety and your salvation on the Day of Judgment, free a slave. Unshackling your slave will unshackle your own limbs on the Day of Judgment. Just endless. In fact, not only are there, you could probably have a whole book just of hadiths encouraging freeing slaves. There's so many hadiths that were made up to free slaves. So it's not just that the Prophet said it, it's like Muslims, some little factory was just churning out forged hadiths as well about freeing slaves. So I don't know who forged hadiths, but they were obsessed with emancipation as well. I don't know of any philosophical or religious tradition that is as obsessed with emancipation as the Islamic tradition. And I feel like, I say that as a Muslim, but I feel 100% confident saying that regardless of who would come and debate that, would be whatever their religious background or philosophical background. And these are examples that we can give from the Quran, from reliable hadiths. And even, by the way, let's say all these hadiths are made up. Let's say the Quran was made up by Muslims in 800 AD because it was some big conspiracy. Then those people would be obsessed with emancipation. So it doesn't even have to be authentic. There's still obsession with it. This is played out in fiqh. If I go, because there's a principle that's agreed upon, which is actually cited as a hadith, but it's not a very reliable hadith, which is that God wants freedom. The lawgiver wants freedom. So if you free your slave and you're not really serious, you're joking, they're still free. If you go to your slave, you say, okay, after you're done working today, you're free to go, you're free, i.e. you're free of work. Boom, you've accidentally freed your slave. If you say to your son, ya ibni, come here, you've actually freed him because you're not allowed to own your own relatives. Boom, that freed. Of course you didn't intend this stuff, but the law is construed so that any possibility of freedom is taken advantage of. If you're walking down the street and you run into a woman, you bump her and you say, ya hurra, oh, asif ya hurra. And it turns out she's your slave woman, she gets freed because you called her a free woman, just like as a sign of respect. You didn't even know it was your own slave. I could give endless examples of this in books of fiqh and in also fatwas and also in court cases. So it's not just theory, it's also in practice. Okay. What Islam does, and this is again not debated, although interestingly it's not stated clearly in the Quran, but it's not debated. It's understood as being part of Islamic law, the Sharia from the very beginning. The main ways that people were enslaved in the Near East and in world history were closed off. You cannot have debt slaves. You cannot enslave someone for committing a crime. People cannot sell their children into slavery. People cannot sell themselves into slavery. The only way that someone can be enslaved in Islamic law is if a Muslim captures a non-Muslim outside the abode of Islam. So you can't enslave like a Christian or Jew or Hindu who's living under Muslim rule. You can't enslave that. If you have to go outside the abode of Islam, and if you capture a non-Muslim, then you can enslave them. And by the way, there was even a lot of debate amongst Muslim scholars about whether you can, if you go, let's say, outside the abode of Islam to the steppes of Russia or to sub-Saharan Africa, and some chief or some parent wants to sell their child, or some chief wants to sell like 500 of his people to you, as a Muslim, can you buy them? And one opinion is, no, you can't, because these people were not enslaved legally. The other opinion, which ends up winning, which is oddly enough the more liberal opinion, says if it's acceptable in their culture, then you can buy those slaves. So if it's acceptable in that people's culture for them to sell their children into slavery or to sell their people into slavery, you can buy them. as slaves already. So two really important changes brought in by Islamic law. One, obsession with emancipation. Two, closing off all the doorways paths into slavery except capture and war. And three, the third one, is a high standard of treatment for slaves, very high standard of treatment. And this is based on lots of hadiths, but the main asl is the Prophet's hadith that hum ikhwanukum ja'alahum Allahu tahta aydikum, right? They are your brothers that God has put under your control. So feed them from what you eat, clothe them from your clothing, and do not burden them overly. And if you burden them too much, then you have to help them. So this is very important hadith. It's in Bukhari, Muslim, and all the main hadith collections and numerous narrations. And that's the asl, that's like the main principle. And there's lots of other examples I can go into about the importance of good treatment of your slaves. One of them being that la yadkhul al-jannah sayyi al-malaka, right? So the person who is a bad owner of slaves will not enter heaven. This is a hadith in Sunan ibn Majah. In addition to the fact that it's well attested in hadith in Sunan ibn Majah and other books that the Prophet on his deathbed, what was he saying? He was muttering, as-salah wa-salah wa ma malakat aymanukum. As-salah, as-salah wa ma. Prayer, prayer, and those that you possess, right? You take care of your prayer and take care of those people you possess. Okay, so now I want to talk about the abolition of slavery in Islam. Okay. And it's accurate. It is accurate to say that prior to the 1800s, no Muslim suggested the idea of abolishing slavery. That is totally accurate. Remember, it's accurate to say that in world history, pretty much nobody proposed that idea prior to the 1700s or even the late 1600s. Remember, people who started the abolitionist movement isn't explained by moral awakening, it's explained by economic and technological change. And yeah, that economic and technological change didn't happen in Muslim societies. And by the way, we can have a lot of debate about whether we think industrialization is good or bad. Well, now that there's like 2 billion more people who were belching car fumes and things like that into the world, we'll see how long our world survives. I'm not so sure modernization is a good idea to begin with, but I have no idea. I'm not going to judge. I mean, I don't have the knowledge. I'm not wise enough to judge. But so when people say like abolitionism is a Western idea, yeah, that's true. But it's not a Western idea because there's some gene in Western civilization or in Christianity that explains this. It's because the Industrial Revolution emerged in the West. But Muslims, scholars make lots of totally legitimate arguments for why we should embrace the idea of abolition. So I'm going to go through a list of Muslim responses to abolition. I'm going to go through a couple of different responses Muslims have had. The first is the most morally outraged. Right? So the first one is the one that's like the strongest moral outrage at slavery. And the least is the least morally outraged. The last is the least morally outraged. But what you'll see is that the cost of these approaches is directly proportional to their moral outrage. So the first one that's the most morally outraged at the idea of slavery also exerts the highest cost on our understanding of religion. In fact, it really asks us to totally reconceptualize what it means to be Muslim. And that's something that I don't think is a correct approach, personally. So the first approach, and this is only held by a few Muslim thinkers like Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, who's a famous Indian Muslim scholar who died in 1898. He basically says that actually slavery was never supposed to be allowed in Islam. And that the Quran, like all the verses of the Quran that talk about ma malakat aymanukum and freeing slaves and stuff like that, these were all only accepting slavery that already existed. So they affirmed current slavery, but that after that, there was not supposed to be any more slavery. The problem with this approach is two things. One, you lose essentially the entirety of the Islamic legal intellectual tradition, because it was all totally wrong. It was completely misunderstood the Quran. The second problem is, it doesn't really even satisfy the moral demands of modernity regarding slavery, because if slavery is really an absolute evil throughout space and time, God shouldn't have allowed it even for those existing relationships. God shouldn't have said, you know, you can have the slaves you have right now, but no new ones. It should have been, get rid of it immediately. And even that, even Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan doesn't argue that. The second approach says, okay, slavery was impossible to get rid of immediately because it was too economically, socially prevalent and ubiquitous in life in Arabia. But that the Quran set, the Prophet set Muslims on a trajectory to ending slavery. And they should have done that right away. Like, so if you take together the fact that Islam closes off almost all routes into slavery, and you combine that with the emphatic encouragement to free slaves, the end result is like kind of slavery was sort of ended on its own. And it should have done that within the first couple of decades, but Muslims didn't get the message and they kind of went off the rails. So that argument is better in the sense that you're not arguing that we've misunderstood the Quran or misunderstood the Sunnah of the Prophet. We just haven't lived up to their expectations. The problem with that argument is that it doesn't really give modern people what they want, because it doesn't say that if slavery was an absolute evil, then why did God and the Prophet allow it at all, right? Idolatry was eliminated completely. Idolatry was very prevalent in Arabia and in the Middle East. But there was no negotiation. There was no, oh, get rid of it when you can. So you don't really get that, you still don't get this moral condemnation that a lot of modern people would want. The third approach, and I think this is, in my opinion, the most accurate approach, is that emancipation is an aim of the Sharia. And this is not a debate. You can't debate this. Emancipation is an aim of the Sharia. It is one of the maqasid of Sharia. We know that because it's long been a principle amongst Muslim scholars that God wants freedom. God looks expectantly towards freedom. That's clear from the Quran, it's clear from the Sunnah of the Prophet, it's clear from the fiqh of jurists, it's clear from how that fiqh functioned in Muslim society. And that the problem is that there's a difference between emancipation and abolition. But as I said before, abolition really wasn't on the menu. It wasn't considered it would be like saying, you know, getting rid of rain or getting rid of snow or something. It was like a feature of life. Slavery was a feature of life that people couldn't imagine being able to be rid of because they needed human labor. They needed cheap human labor to be able to do things. When you have the capacity to have things moved and services performed without relying on humans and animals, then you don't need those humans and animals to do it anymore. And in that context, in a post-industrial, in the era of post-industrial revolution, we know Muslims no longer have, no one has any need for slavery. So in that situation, the best way to fulfill the aim of the Sharia is to end the class of slavery as a whole. The next option, which is also accurate, but I mean, I don't find it as compelling as this one, is to say that because the only way you can get slaves is to capture them in war, that the person who's in charge of political decisions about making war and making peace, namely the Muslim leader, can simply decide, I don't want to take any slaves. And that's actually a choice given to the Wali al-Amr, or the Khalifa, or the Sultan, is they can say, these prisoners, I want them free. That's the decision given by the ruler. The next option says, you can think about it as, if you can't do it right, you can't do it at all. This has the idea that the Sharia has certain requirements for how slaves are supposed to be treated. So if people are systematically mistreating them, or systematically enslaving, let's say, Muslims when they shouldn't be doing that, that you basically ban slavery because you're not able to prevent its abuses. And this is the argument made in 1846 by the governor of Tunis, which at the time was part of the Ottoman Empire, but it was really independent. in 1846, Ahmed Bey, the governor of Tunis, issues what's actually one of the earliest local abolition decrees in the world. He basically says everyone born in Tunis from now on will be free, and no one can legally be held as a slave. So if anyone's a slave, come to one of these certain offices and get something stamped for you, and you'll be freed. Why did he say this? He said too many of the people who are being enslaved in sub-Saharan Africa are actually Muslims, and slaves are not being treated well enough. They're not being treated according to the Sharia requirements for how slaves are supposed to be treated. So basically, no one can do it anymore. That's essentially the full range of arguments. The last argument would be simply that, what are you talking about? Slavery is wrong. This is just a Western idea. And doesn't have any Islamic legitimacy. My response to those people is, that doesn't work, because you guys are all Muslims, right? I mean, and if you go to Turkey or Jordan or Tunis or wherever, you talk to Muslims and you ask them if slavery is wrong, they're going to say it's wrong too. I mean, if they're not, they're really kind of not being honest. Most people today who live in the world, certainly in the kind of global West, have really strong instinctive feelings that slavery is wrong. So you can't just say it's like a Western idea, because this idea has penetrated even into non-Western societies, even amongst Muslims who are really committed to their religion. They aren't Westernized in any other way. Okay. There's actually, I forgot one thing. One big change that Islamic law brings to slavery, which is fascinating, is that the descendants of if a Muslim slave owner has a child with this female slave, the child is free, at the same social standing as children born of his free wife, and that when the master dies, his slave woman is freed. This is unprecedented in world history as far as I know. It's totally unprecedented in the Near East. And the result is that, part of what explains why there's no indigenous abolition movement in the Muslim world prior to kind of Western abolitionism, because if you're how would you know who's a slave in Islamic civilization, in an Islamic society? It's not based on skin color, it's not based on race, because if you see someone who's dark-skinned, they could be a slave, or they could be the free son of some super powerful merchant and his female slave. And that person is a free person and is like a 100% part of the elite. So there's not like a racial way of telling who's a slave and who's not. And that's really important. Because if you're a black person in the Caribbean or in North America prior to the end of slavery, let's say you're not a slave, let's say you're a freed person, or let's say you're the descendant of free blacks. Are you enfranchised in that society? Not only are you not enfranchised, but you actually constantly live under what threat? You can be enslaved. Somebody can come and say, oh, you're a slave. Like in 12 Years a Slave, right? So the only route to safety is either you leave somehow and flee to some other place. Or you have to end the institution. The institution itself has to end to provide any level of security. In Islamic civilization, you don't have that, because someone's appearance is in no way correlates to their status, free or slave. Just so you can see how much has affected the elite, almost all the Abbasid caliphs, right, from Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, when the Abbasid revolution happens in 750, till the end of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in 1258, and all of the Ottoman caliphs, I think except one, were children of slaves. So their fathers were the caliph or the sultan, and their mother was a slave woman. So Thomas Jefferson, if he were a Muslim, like under Islamic law, his children would have been legitimate children of Thomas Jefferson. able to go, they were free, they would be, like Kennedys or something, having their own political dynasty or something like that. Okay, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. So I assume that people have questions, which I have time for question and answer, right? So I'm happy to.
Yes.
Okay, I'm happy to hear what you have to say or take your comments or whatever. Yes.
Are there any rules in Islam regarding concubinage? Like if the lady's already married?
If the lady's already married, and she's captured in war, but if she's already married, so here's the thing. So slaves can marry in Islamic law. So you can, if you have a slave, female slave, and she marries somebody, then she can't be the concubine of her owner. She's off limits. She's like any other married woman. Yes.
So it's sort of a thin point, but I understand the difference between abolition and emancipation. But isn't that like severe push for emancipation comes from the idea that slavery is bad? Like there is an inherent evil in it that the Quran and the Prophet are constantly pushing against.
So there's an interesting, it's a good point. Thank you for bringing this up because, and this is something that Tasneem actually helped me with my book research, which is that so Muslim scholars always acknowledged that slavery was harmful. They talked about it as, they used the word darar. Darar means harmful. Right? So what's harmful about slavery? They said, you don't get to make your own choices. You don't control your own labor. You're not a full legal person. Like, for example, you can't be, according to some schools of law, you can't be a witness in court if you're a slave, right? You couldn't be the leader of the Muslim community. So they acknowledge this is harmful. But that harm was superseded by property rights. So somebody's property right was stronger than the harm that was inflicted on that person. So in a lot of ways, what's happened in modern times since the Industrial Revolution is that the harm we see the harm as greater, and that we push down or reduce the property right. And that's really like a choice of prioritization. It's not about changing your point of view completely. It's about like how are you going to prioritize harms and benefits.
Yeah, I think that's a great argument because I hope I don't offend anyone, but like even the idea of a civil war that targets people's property rights ends up in so much evil. The idea of a more voluntary emancipation that wouldn't have happened. I'm not talking alternative history.
Well, yeah, this is something that people, I'm not a specialist in American history, but I do know that there's, people talk about whether or not, like the amount of money that the North spent fighting the Civil War, they could have like bought out all the slaves in the South like many times over with that amount of money. And it's interesting when you see the debates amongst Christians in the 1700s and the 1800s about abolition. Like Christians would say, Christians who weren't supportive of ending slavery would say, look, if slavery is evil, why did the Bible allow it? Why did Jesus allow it? Why didn't Jesus say, hey, slavery is really bad? He never said that. And the abolitionists would say, okay, well, Jesus didn't say that because it would cause too much strife, and it would have really undermined his ability to teach. To which their opponents said, I don't know if you read the Bible, but Jesus wasn't exactly, afraid of controversy in the Bible. So, and in addition, they say, I understand your point, but we're kind of having strife right now in the 1800s. It's called the Civil War. So they're like, even 1800 years later, there's still massive trauma being caused over this debate. So it's very interesting to read the Western debates over this because you see that they're having the same discussions that Muslims have like 50, 60 years later.
I'm sorry, can I just ask if there's additional time?
Yeah, I guess.
About
you're going to come up here and discuss things. Was that the arguments?
Yes, Mr. Sure.
I'm pretty sure it shouldn't just be a white guy talking about this. We need to have some balance here. What was your...
A big shock, a big thing that Muslims are attacked about is sexual access and female body autonomy when it comes to concubines and PME. Those verses are all over.
Yeah.
And they don't come in the same sense of condemnation or like push for emancipation that comes with slavery as a student.
Yeah, that's a tough topic. I leave that to the end of I wrote a book on this issue of slavery in Islam. If you want to read more about it.
You wrote a book on this?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe you didn't know. So that's the last chapter. I talk only about female concubinage because it's so hard for us to deal with because you get two problems. One, you have the problem of slavery. Two, you have the problem of consent. The consent issue I would just deal with in the following way, which is that in Islamic law in general, consent is very important for sex and marriage for certain people. But it doesn't do the work that we would have it do in American law or in American society. For Islamic law, that work is done through the concept of harm. So we have lots of examples in fiqh and in legal cases where female slaves or wives, in theory, in Islamic law, like a wife doesn't have any right to consent to sex because the marriage itself is that consent, right? But that doesn't mean that the husband can just do whatever he wants. We have lots of cases in Islamic law where the judge or the jurist will say, you can't do this thing because this thing is harmful. You can't do that thing because this thing is harmful. So the same thing with female slaves. So you can't engage in harmful conduct. Now, what defines harm? Harm is defined generally by custom. So in our societies today, we could agree if this is right or wrong, but whatever the case, in American society today, we valorize consent so much, we valorize autonomy so much, that any non-consensual touching or sex would be, we see it as per se extremely harmful. That's what we consider. So if there were a Sharia court in America today, I'm not trying to do like Sharia creepers. If there were a Sharia court and a Sharia judge in America today, and a wife came up and said, my husband had sex with me without my consent, that would be, in our society, defined as harm. I would imagine that that judge would do what you would have, one of the things that the wife would have to be compensated, or if the wife wanted out of the marriage, that the judge would do what's called the tafriq, or judicial separation. Like, I'm separating you two, the marriage is over, wife gets to keep the dowry, or has to be paid a back-end dowry. So I think a lot of this has to do with when you start thinking about what consent does for us in our society. What is consent supposed to do? Consent is supposed to protect us against harm. So in Islamic law, they just have the direct discussion about harm. If you're interested in this, I would recommend reading the last chapter of my book on slavery in Islam. Yes?
Thank you so much for your talk.
Okay.
Yes, and in Islam, the Torah is one of the holy books, including Exodus, and I'm assuming. And I'm a revert, so I grew up with the Bible, not Islam. And so I was wondering if you could talk about an Islamic parallel to liberation theology. So when Moses freed the Israelites, wasn't that symbolic of our liberation, our freedom from slavery? And even the idea of slavery being prohibited based on the golden rule, like what you want for your brother, you want for yourself.
Yeah. So the Quran does mention that Beni Israel, that they were enslaved. But the main way that the Quran talks about this condition of the Jews in Egypt is not slavery, it's what's called istid'af, being oppressed in the land. So they were talked about as being mustad'afina fil ard. You were oppressed in the land. And that's the way the Quran also talks about the Muslims in Mecca before they moved to Medina. So the kind of the metaphor of the Israelites' exodus is the metaphor of the Muslims' exodus from Mecca to Medina, and the exodus from kufr to belief, right? But the Quran talks about this through the language of oppression, not the language of slavery, which is an interesting choice because, well, we've had this long discussion about what slavery is. We can disagree how to define it. well, no one would support oppression. So I think, like, in a way, I would say that the Quran actually cuts through a layer of definitional problem and just gets to the real issue, which is people being oppressed. But this is a good question. Thank you.
So I think we had discussed this during the break a bit, but when I thought about the issue or the scourge of slavery, I thought about the verses of the alcohol, the use and commission of alcohol in Islam. Initially, alcohol was permitted, and then later verses were arrived where it said that you don't come to prayer drunk. Then later it was completely entirely abolished.
Yeah.
So it's not that God was wrong, and then he had to correct himself twice over, but it was because at that time the society or the custom couldn't receive that revelation. So I wonder if it's the same.
I think it's a similar discussion, right? So we talked about this approaches to abolition in the Islamic tradition. One approach was that, it should have, God didn't prohibit slavery because it wasn't possible to get rid of it, but that Muslims were sort of set on this trajectory to end it. Restrict the ways in, encourage the ways out, so you end up with kind of end of slavery. And then there's just the question of whether that should have happened like right away, which is that second approach I mentioned, which is you see as being advocated by people like Racialization, died in 1935, or Sayyid Amir Ali, died in 1926, various Muslim thinkers from the Near East and India. Or the other one, which is that it's an aim of the Sharia. So when abolition becomes possible, when it becomes part of the discussion, then it should be taken as the best way to fulfill the idea of maximizing emancipation, because emancipation is one of the aims of the Sharia. That approach, in my opinion, is the best because, one, it is fully authentic and true to the Islamic tradition, and second, I hate to say this, but it doesn't impose what's actually a very problematic concept, which is that slavery was always wrong in world history. If slavery was always wrong in world history, then why are all these great minds that we respect and listen to and read their books today, why didn't they say this? Why did they say the opposite? I mean, was Thomas Aquinas an idiot? St. Augustine an idiot? Was Al-Ghazali a moron? And I'm more intelligent than them? So somehow we get it or not, I think that's very problematic.
So I was blessed to be able to read excerpts from your book. One of the considerations, multiple considerations, but you were able to, in your research and your citations, to pull a lot of colloquial expressions together, popular culture references, as well as the academic background to substantiate that. How long did it take for you to research and write this book in that manner?
Oh, come on, man. You're not going to...
I'm serious. I'm serious. I'm serious because one of the things that I see in our society when you have somebody of high academic standing, they don't write in a manner that the layperson can understand and read. Your manner of writing is palatable for anybody at that level. And one of the things is to be able to connect with your audience. So I'm curious how long it took for you to write it in that manner.
I mean, I think that, feel bad you didn't mic without you, it has sonorous a voice. So that, mashallah, I mean, I would say that it really, like, for me, I wrote this book, people say, a lot of people said to me, you can't write this book because you're a white guy. I understand, like, believe me, yeah, I'm a 100% privileged person. Like the other day, I was sitting with my wife, I was like, one of my main regrets in life is that what was it? I didn't buy this one tie at a street market in Seattle. Like, that's my biggest regret. My wife was like, what the hell is what kind of life have you had? So I have, even like Islamophobia I get is like, nice Islamophobia. So I know that I have immense privilege. But the reason I care about this issue, I'm not trying to make some excuse for Muslims or Islam, or I want to know. Like, I read the Quran and I didn't understand. I want to know the answer to this. Why is it that the Quran doesn't condemn something that I feel is wrong? Why was it that Muslims allow something I don't understand? How could the Prophet have allowed something that I couldn't imagine? I want to know the answer to that. So, and when I think I feel satisfied with my answer, and I wanted to make this accessible to as many people as possible. The second thing I would say is that the problem on this topic isn't really at the philosophical level, right? So if you got a bunch of philosophers together, academically, there wouldn't be a slavery conundrum. Because, I mean, think about it. Are you really telling me that the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire and this field hand in South Carolina, that you can't make a distinction between? That's absurd. That's absurd, right? So, but that's not a feature of like high-level discourse. It's a feature of almost a popular American discourse on this. So it's the problem, the stumbling blocks for us are not at a high level. They're actually at the popular level in ours. That's what I would say. So that's why I really try to invoke a lot of kind of colloquial examples or pop culture examples, not because I'm trying to sound cool, because that's actually the level at which our discussion derails.
Identification.
Yeah.
So we can all identify at that level. I had a kind of a different conclusion as I was reading, and the perspective I deduced from your writing is you almost performed what I saw as like an autopsy on the institution of slavery within Islam. And what I mean by that is within the sciences, science does have its biases based on your academic training. You acknowledge that up front, and what you just said was an acknowledgement of that. I'm white, I'm Muslim. So by putting out those biases in your examination process, it allowed for a more objective discourse. This is what I'm presented with up front. These are the lenses in which I'm going to have to mitigate my view from. So it became what I saw as kind of like an autopsy, where these are the facts. This is the conclusions I come to based on the facts that I've deduced. You can come to your conclusions because what I'm listing is the facts, the evidence, the historical context for it. And it became more of a nuanced discussion based on it. There wasn't a desire to intentionally create excuses for why something happened. What we don't have now is, like you said, is nuanced discussion where there are some topics that simply cannot be broached. The oppression Olympics we play in society now. Me as a black male, I'm more oppressed than a white male. Me as a black male, I'm more oppressed than a Latina female. So by examining those lenses up front, it seemed like you were able to address from an academic and from a social standpoint what I saw as kind of an autopsy on the institution of Islam and slavery. Is that a fair conclusion?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, because I think like once you identify that my issue is, once you kind of step out of the American context, I think the American context really limits you because you're totally trapped in the problem of race. You're trapped in the problem of class and race in America and stuff. Like once you start talking about Islamic tradition, it just becomes a totally different discussion. That's the discussion I'm interested in. Like I don't really care if Thomas Jefferson was a great guy or not, because I have no commitment to Thomas Jefferson. I have no commitment to George Washington. I mean, they were good guys or bad guys, it doesn't matter. What matters to me is like the Prophet, what matters to me is the Quran. And so that's what I was like interested in discussing. And I think the American context is like very, it's really like shackles you to, sorry for the idiom of use, but.
The shackling. So one of the conclusions I came to also was you were going through the process of defining what slavery is and what slavery is not. And slavery is always subjectively defined. And what I kind of saw is it almost represents one's ability to define their privilege. So in gradation, it's a gradation of, well, I'm a slave only in comparison to somebody above or below me. Our privilege almost seems to define when you talk about the status of the Turkish, the Ottoman Turk Empire. Somebody is only a slave or defining themselves based on where they're at within that subjective society that they're in. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think this is an important point to make because we think about sort of slave and free as these uniform, it's kind of the way society is divided. So free people are better off than slave people. Actually, in most of world history, and certainly in the kind of Mediterranean, Near Eastern world, the slave's position is defined by the position of their master. So if you're the slave of Julius Caesar, or if you're the slave of the Sultan, you might be like 1,000,000 times richer and more powerful. Like Julius Caesar or the Sultan might send you, like you go and govern this area. and you go with your whole army and you're in charge of that area. So you're actually more powerful than countless free people because you're the direct tool of your master who happens to be super powerful and wealthy. So that's something that is that doesn't really make sense in American context. Because in American context, slave and race function to appease white people. So like I think it was Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon who said this, that you can pretty much do whatever you want to poor white people because you just have to tell them that black people are worse than that, right? That black people are inferior. And so the inferiority of blacks allows you to sort of infinitely deprive poor white people because they'll always just think they can still kick down on the black guy.
Which is one of the reasons I refer to the Jim Crow period as neo-slavery. In essence, there was an increase in privilege, but for what we define as freedoms and opportunities, those were reduced compared to the contemporaries. So now you see every time slavery is broached, an old trope will come up about how the Irish were slaves when they first came here also. But the institutions were different fundamentally in how their treatment was seen here. So now when you hit the Jim Crow period, you often saw, well, if nothing else, I may not be wealthy, but I'm not black.
Yeah.
So that became its own definition of what privilege was, and everybody was in a gradation either above or below that. And I kind of see that theme that's even transcended into modern time. We don't speak about it and see it as freely, but there's this undercurrent that often says, I may not be this, I may not be as rich as Bill Gates, but I'm not black, I'm not this. I'm not defined by this marginalized group, which was another concept you talked about in terms of referencing what slavery is and is not, is to the degree in which you're marginalized in that society.
I think this brings up an important point in Islamic civilization, and in the Sharia in general. And people love to say, oh, the Sharia persecutes non-Muslims because non-Muslims don't have the same rights as Muslims. My answer is yeah, you know how you become a Muslim? You just say, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, and then you're a Muslim. Like you can instantaneously enter the elite. And someone might say, oh, that's wrong, you shouldn't have to change your religion to do that. I was like, okay, fine. But you know what? In order to become an elite in the United States and lots of other countries, let's say you're undocumented or you're not a citizen. There's literally nothing you can do. Pretty much nothing you can do to ever enjoy the same rights as other people. They were born into through no virtue of their own. Right? Or you can't change your skin color. You can't change people's racist views. So, if you were, and if you read my book, I give countless examples of this, like the elites who have African phenotypes, like the books written by Ibn al-Jawzi, Jalaluddin al-Suyuti, al-Jahid, books that are hundreds of pages long, where they list all the great figures in world history and in Islamic history who are African. And why did they write those books? They wrote those books because they said, we do not want people who are black, we do not want them to think that they are lowly people. And so again, you can say, oh, Muslims are racist or something. How many of you have written hundreds of page-long book giving all the great people in world history and Islamic history who are black? I mean, I'm not in any way trying to give Arabs or Desis like a free pass on racism. Like, they're so racist a lot of the time, and that's unacceptable. And I don't accept that. I would immediately reprimand anybody who did, because it's completely against the positions of our beliefs of our religion. But we have to also take into consideration the efforts that Muslim scholars made to fight against that racism, which is really important.
That was really pronounced in comparing that to our modern societies and the development of the societies against the social, academic, and legal development of Islamic societies. Because what you see comparing the American society is, at what point do you have an enslaved group that is fully integrated into the society after they become free? So if you compare with the examples you just provided, once you become free, you are supposed to be a citizen if you are Muslim in the society. Comparing that to the American experience, at what point where black people fully integrated into the society, less the legal constructs, because you still had the social constructs. And I've only seen a couple examples of that which would be a Korean group that was enslaved during World War II and taken to Japan. They still weren't fully allowed to integrate. Whereas in the Islamic tradition, if you're free and you're Muslim, you're integrated into that Muslim society. Is that kind of what you're referencing?
Yeah, this is an idea. It's developed by an African scholar named Ali Mazrui. I think he died in 2014. He's a Kenyan scholar. And he taught at SUNY Binghamton. And he talked about the idea of ascending miscegenation. So miscegenation is like racial mixing. So in an American system of slavery, if you had miscegenation, you miscegenated down into the slave class. So like Thomas Jefferson's children were slaves and they were not white. Whereas in the Islamic tradition, you miscegenated up into the free society of Muslims and enfranchised people. And that's again one of the reasons you don't have indigenous movements for abolition is that there's the slaves population is like getting sort of sucked upward over time into the free population. And just to let you know an example of this, like if you go back to the early generation of Muslims, people like Ibn Ishaq, author of the Sirah, his grandfather was a slave. Ibn Sirin, father was a slave. Hassan al-Basri, father was a slave. Makhul al-Shami, father was a slave. Or they were freed slaves. I can give you, if you go back to look at the great scholars of the first 2 or 3 generations, a lot of them are either freed slaves or they're children of freed slaves. And they're, Bilal's another example, right? So, and by the way, I'm not talking about, I'm being very careful because Mawla can sometimes just mean someone who's a non-Arab convert. I made very sure that the people I just mentioned are not non-Arab converts to Islam. They are actually either freed slaves or their parents, one of their parents was a freed slave. So to the extent that Az-Zuhri, the famous early scholar, died 742, huge early hadith transmitter, he said, the ilm has been taken over, knowledge has been taken over by the Mawali. Like the Arabs, he says that Arabs are retired and gone. Arabs' time is over. Knowledge has been taken over by the Mawali. These are the freed slaves of early Islam are the ones who become the great scholars.
So one of the things, and it's kind of a personal perspective and how I evaluate a lot of situations, I start with a simple question no matter what the subject is. Could I accept the possibility that I could be wrong? And it's a great research-driven tool. And it seemed like you displaced any personal bias to the best of your ability in conducting your research. You're not looking for a conclusion prior to starting your research, and you let the research kind of render what the decision-making, what process was. Is that a fair way to evaluate kind of the research project? This is the question. I could be wrong about any existing conclusion that I have. Let's see where the research lays.
Well, I mean, I would say that except for one thing, which is, I think I might even have said this in the book, which is that, you know, I do not think it's possible that the Prophet ﷺ committed egregious moral wrong. I just don't think that's possible. And the problem is, if you do think that's possible, then it kind of raises a lot of questions about, yeah, I mean, like, why, you know, what does being Muslim mean? So that, I sort of said that pretty, I think it was toward the end of the book, I'm not sure. But that's the only, it was funny because one of my students kind of called me on that when I was handed a draft out to my undergraduates a couple of years ago. He was like, well, why don't you just say this, because you know you believe this, so why don't you just say it? And I think that's the one thing. But I think that, you know, if you're open about it, then the reader knows that that's your belief. And my guess is that a lot of people who are Christian or Jewish or come from backgrounds where they also revere Scripture, they have that person in their Scripture too, right? So Jesus or Moses or something, right? So they all have those authorities that they're not willing to condemn morally. And so I think that there's a reader more often has that kind of belief as well. It just happens to be in a different tradition.
And whether they can see that that's actually a potential bias that they have. What I hope is that everybody gets the opportunity to read the book because, as I stated before, it's written in a perspective it's written in a prose that everybody can understand. Sometimes it's difficult, embarrassing for me to read something with the academic background that Dr. Brown has. I feel like I'm missing the concept, the language, the vocabulary that's chosen. But you can parse through the concepts, and we can all kind of identify it. One, being within the American construct. Two, more so being Muslim. It's easy to understand the concepts and the manner of reading that Dr. Brown wrote in. So that's just my invitation. As a layperson, you can definitely understand it and accept the concepts, and it makes you think. When you're not trying to come to a conclusion based on somebody else's writing, but they allow you to critique it and think for yourself. And when you can arrive to similar conclusions, it's that much more palatable. It's that much more, there's more of a feeling to it emotionally that I was able to experience. Were there any other questions the crowd had for Dr. Brown?
Safe?
So I want to go back to the last question that before we started this discussion. You took the position that abolition was the best case of emancipation. I'm quoting, I'm just paraphrasing what you said. And then in another instance, you mentioned that the Sultan had the opinion, or the Sultan's opinion would be the thing to go. The question that I want to bring you back to, and I was wondering while you said that, was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, مَا فَرَّطْنَا فِي الْكِتَابِ مِنْ شَيْءٍ.
Yeah.
And another ayah, الْيَوْمَ أَكْمَلْتُ لَكُمْ دِينَكُمْ وَأَتْمَمْتُ عَلَيْكُمْ نِعْمَتِي. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never reaches the point of abolition.
That's a great question. And this, in my book, I actually have, I think, the most extensive discussion of this issue, which is really weird because it's such an important topic. It's called taqyid al-mubah, restriction of what's permissible. So the Quran talks about right? So why do you prohibit what God has made permissible for you? So you can't say that something's haram if God hasn't made it haram. And you can't, so God and the Prophet didn't prohibit slavery, so why are we allowed to prohibit it? We're not allowed to prohibit it, in the sense we're not allowed to say it's haram. But we are allowed to prohibit it in the sense of making something illegal. And the example is, here would be like driving on the right side of you can't drive on the left side of the road, not because God said you can't. God never said don't drive on the left side of the road. But this is part of the siyasa authority of the ruler, which is to promote law and order, and to promote the maslahah, the best interest, and the common good of Muslims. So you're allowed to you can't prohibit something that is required. So I can't say I prohibit praying, or I can't say I prohibit fasting, or I can't require you to eat during fasting. That I can't do as a ruler. But I can say I require, let's say, slaves to be treated in a certain way. Or if I think that we don't need slavery anymore, and I'm going to prohibit any importation of slaves in the future, I can do that, because I'll say this is an aim of the Sharia, and it's no longer economically required. The main thing I can imagine someone rebutting or objecting to is saying, oh, well, you're saying that slavery is evil just like driving on the left-hand side of the road is evil. No, that's not what I'm saying. Except that I am saying, yeah, that the evil of slavery is a customary evil. And I know that makes people uncomfortable, but my main evidence for that is, if it were a universal evil throughout space and time, why did none of the greatest minds and hearts in human society ever say this? That would be, if it's a universal evil throughout space and time, give me evidence for that being the case. Kyle, yes.
I've had a long time talking.
You're standing up, so it seems like you're
bad.
Okay.
I just had kind of just as you were talking, I had a thought that if you were to go way back, obviously, the span of time back to Adam and the first human beings, obviously there was no such thing as slavery. At some point, it got innovated based on probably between war. I don't know if you did any research in the book, because I haven't read the book yet, about the inception of slavery, but to me, it seems like there's no way, unless it was just like based on like that, I don't understand how it could have been initially okay. Like the first person who got enslaved was not like, I'll be a slave. You know?
Yeah.
So at some point it was definitely wrong from the beginning.
Well, so there's a scholar named Ibn al-Mundhir, died in about 930 of the Common Era. So he's from Nishapur in northeastern Iran. And he says in one of his books, he says that God created Adam, and he created Adam's partner, right? وَحَصَّنَهُ مِنَ الرِّقِّ. He made him immune to slavery. And this is, by the way, not even given in the context of slavery, a debate. It's just the debate of something, the context of another discussion. And all descendants of Adam are free. The only situation in which a descendant of Adam can become a slave is if they're an unbeliever that a Muslim captures in the abode of war. So the reason I bring this up is to say that there is a very strong belief or position in Islamic thought, law and theology and philosophy, that humans are naturally free and that the situations in which they can become a slave are very limited. As I said before, for a long time, the majority position of Muslim scholars was that you couldn't even buy someone who'd been enslaved in another society if you were outside the abode of Islam. You couldn't, they hadn't been enslaved properly. The question then becomes like, how does sort of slavery begin? And I would ask the question like this: how do you have situations in which people are put into positions or put themselves into positions of extreme dependence or servitude? And the answer seems to be twofold from what we have in terms of historical records. One is that capture and war. Two is debt or poverty. And three is just like being a total outsider. So if you end up like in a place in a society where you're completely alone and you have nobody to protect you at all, like you attach yourself to some existing family or tribe or clan or something like that you're like in a marginal position. You attach yourself to protection. So it seems like those are the three main sort of: one is capture and war, two is debt, three is sort of being in extremely marginal position.
How we doing on time?
I think we had agreed that we'd end at 4:45, inshallah. That's right. Probably was at 5.
Okay. So I wanted to ask a question about that's it's about slavery, but it's also about race. All right. So one of the things that you said in the book, and you said it here, and we reiterated in my group, that that our notions of the racialization of slavery is purely an American lens. Right? However, I really feel like I haven't done the reading on this personally. I've read some articles, but nothing too deep. But it's my belief that in Muslim majority places in the Middle East, Arab majority countries, and maybe even South Asian countries, that there's a deep and abiding anti-blackness. Right? It's not a commentary from like my personal interactions necessarily, but just my observations. So I would, and just as a note before I kind of get to the question, one of the things that a lot of African Americans are doing now is their DNA. And one of the things that, in looking at my own DNA sort of research, one of the things that I noticed, not just for myself, but a lot of African Americans, there's a strand of our DNA that's actually connected to Zanzibar. And so so I started to read the history about this a little bit, thinking most of our ancestry comes really from West Africa, right? So, Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon, Congo. But all the way Mozambique and Zanzibar. I'm like, how is that such a big chunk? It's actually a good 10% chunk of our ancestry. And so I started looking at that, and it's because of the Arab slave trade in East and Southeast Africa, right? And so in looking at that, at some point in time, there was a racialization of slavery that happened before the transatlantic trade, the Euro-American, what I like to call Euro-American trade. So it happened at some point in time. I just don't know the history of the Arab slave trade well enough. It did get tied into transatlantic trade. They're actually the ones who taught Portuguese, Spanish, and eventually British how to conduct an international trade in slaves. It became racialized before them. I fully and honestly believe that, right?
Okay, so this is a very good question. Are you done? Okay. These are excellent points. But again, we need to be careful with what we mean by race, right? So, has anyone ever watched this series called The Wonders of the African Continent with Henry Louis Gates? Ever watched this? I think it was made in the 1990s. It's really interesting. He walks around like Africa in the Harvard t-shirt the whole time. Anyway, I just remember. So it's really interesting to watch. So he goes to I think he's in Mombasa, or in Lamu in Kenya. And he goes and he talks to this group of Kenyans, right, that they say they're Persian. And he's like, you guys are black. He's like, you're not Persian. And they're like, no, we're Persian. So they look just like everybody else. But their patrilineal ancestor was Persian. So in Islamic Arab notions of Nesab, they are Persian. It doesn't matter if they're dark as midnight, right? They're Persian. So what you had here was a clash of two different ways of understanding race, right? So he's operating on the American system of color, like essentially like what can you pass as, and they're operating on the Islamic notion of Nesab. It doesn't matter what color you are, because if your patrilineal ancestor was the Prophet, and every single person, every single mother through that whole thing was a slave woman from Africa, you're still Arab and you're still a descendant of the Prophet, right? So when we talk about the Arab slave trade, I think we have to be careful when we imagine these like Arab guys like enslaving African people who are black and the Arab people who are not black, right? A lot of the people who are engaged in this slave trade are themselves, we would think of them as black, right? But they saw themselves as Arab or Persian or Indian or something like that. So I think that there is a racialization, but the racialization doesn't take place along the lines of American notions of race. It takes along the ideas of who is Muslim and who's not Muslim. So, and one of the things that Muslim scholars really push back on and correct is people when they start associating blackness with unbelief, because they say these areas you're taking slaves from, they have a lot of Muslims who live there. You can't enslave Muslims. So they're kind of pushing back against people who are being lazy about identifying enslavability based on color, because they're like, look, these people look like they're all Muslim. By the way, the scholars who were writing that also were black. Like we would think that we would go and say that guy's black, but they said no, we're Arab or we're Persian or we're whatever. So I think that it's a very fair discussion to talk about the Muslim slave trade and its abuses in Africa. But I think that we have to be careful about like making it another instance of sort of black people being oppressed by non-blacks. Because even if you go like in Darfur and stuff, people in Darfur are Muslims. The people who were abusing them in the mid-2000s were Muslims, right? So it's not just always like Arabs. And if you see Sudanese Arabs, they look black to me. Like I guess they're Arab, but I thought they were black. But no, they turns out they're Arab. And then Sudanese people are like, oh, we're always being treated. People are always racist against us. But then they're racist against the south, the Dinkas and the Nuer who are to the south of them. So everyone's black compared to somebody else. I don't know if everybody. Maybe like some Norwegian person is probably not black compared to anybody. But the point is that there's how we have to make sure that we're not, when we talk about racialization, that we acknowledge that there's different forms of racialization, different like universes of that are separate from American notions.
If I understood kind of the direction you were going, it's kind of the strata of social structure or globally when it comes to who we define and what we define as black people. You're seeing a resurgence now with the Afro-Latino community with pride in being black, whereas historically there has been no pride associated with being black. And our experiences as Muslims have born kind of that same experience. I recall being a revert and living in Detroit, going into Dearborn, and for some inexplicable reason, the Muslims there wouldn't give me salams. Going to a lot of places and noting within an Islamic environment that there was just something different about me and I was just as Muslim as everybody else. It's that kind of the experience where you see the racialization and it goes back historically. Abid, where you have these slang terms which seem to be associated with black people. I would say it's not just in the Islamic world. It's difficult to say whether the Islamic world bled into these other places or these other places and institutions bled into the Islamic world when it's more pervasive outside the Islamic world. All of South America, all of Central America, there's been this pushback where Brazil, for example, over 55% of the population is now identifying as black. It wasn't popular to be black a decade ago. It's becoming more acceptable. So I wouldn't say it's just in the Islamic world. It's been kind of this growth and acceptance of what it means to be black. I have people approach me now asking me, strangest thing, I've never been asked if I was Yemeni before until last week. Never in my life. I've been asked if I'm Cuban, a lot of things, but somebody of Arab descent, that's my first. And I haven't got any lighter, so even my own construct of what is acceptable is beginning to change because my approaches are changing as well.
I just want to interject a point to kind of connect what Kyle was saying, what you were saying. So like 2 points. South Africa, anybody ever seen the movie Lethal Weapon might have seen that part where the white South Africans start saying to Mel Gibson, "Oh, you're a Kaffir lover." Anybody remember? Yeah. When I was a kid, I was like, what? I guess it's just a random thing that sounds like an Arabic word.
No, it isn't. It comes in.
Exactly. And then later on in life, I found out that's an actual Arabic word from the history when the Arab slave traders were selling African Muslims to the Dutch, and they were like, "Hey, we have Kaffirs," basically, and then the Dutch thought, "Oh, that just means African slave," you know. So there's that concept, I think, that got mixed in, which I don't think the Arabs had intended. But going back, I would love to know about slavery pre-Islam, because I wonder if there is some notion of racialization, because first of all, Bilal was not pure African, number one. I think his dad was from like Syria or something like that, and he was captured. So a lot of people assume like Bilal was African, and so the slavery, a lot of Muslims have the notion that, oh, because he's black, this was such a great move by the Prophet because he was.
No, most of the slaves in Arabia, from what we can see from like books of Nesab and the historical sources we can find, the slavery was very widespread in Arabia, but not very common. So it was like widespread, but there weren't a lot of slaves. They were all over, but they weren't a lot of them. And most of them, there's not one group that dominates. So there's some from Abyssinia. There's Byzantines, people from the north who were captured. The Arab slave enslavement was mostly based on capture, and so there was a lot of like people from what now would be Syria or Palestine or Iraq or Egypt who had been captured by Saracenoid Arab raiders, or just from someone from another tribe. Zayd ibn Haritha was Arab, but he was captured from another tribe in a raid. So. There was not a racialization of slavery there was one group was like Abyssinians who had been captured or were being sold, but that was just one possible. But it seems like the majority were actually other groups who had been captured.
I think I had a kind of a similar question as what both of you were alluding to. And the question I had written was, do you find the historical consistency of African enslavement in the last 1,200 years to be a result of technology, inferior technology, political culture, because of past practice? So we, by default, have viewed black people or sub-Saharan Africans as the default people to go to for slavery as part of the tradition, or is it some type of some type of religious prejudice? So you look in the American system where Christianity, they created a definition of Christianity, an outlook where we're the lost tribe, we're the tribe of Ham, we were the dejected group. So was there a religious perspective that created this institution, or what we see as an institution, of primarily black people being enslaved? I think that kind of limits the part of the world that you're looking at, because if you look at, as referenced earlier, like the Ottoman Turks, the Ottomans, the amount of people that were enslaved and who they enslaved from the Caucasus Mountains, I think our sphere is kind of limited in who we look at globally as having been enslaved, because we only study the enslavement of black people historically in this world?
That's very important because we're using the word slave. Where does that word come from? Slav, right? So in the Europeans, Western Europeans in the Mediterranean, Northern Mediterranean, and in fact, Muslim Mediterranean, get most of their slaves from what's now the steppes of Russia and stuff like that, Eastern Europe. And that only really stops for Western Europe in the 1400s. Why? Because the Ottomans gained complete control of the Black Sea, and they cut off access to like the Venetians and other groups that had been bringing slaves from the Black Sea route. They cut that access off, so they had to go and find another source of slaves. Besides, many of the Slavs in Eastern Europe had converted to Christianity. Christians can't enslave other Christians. So where do they go? They go around to Africa. So yeah, I think there's a lot of it's very important for Muslims to have a discussion about anti-black racism in Muslim society. That's completely unacceptable. But we don't want to think that the history of slavery in the world is a question of blackness in Africa versus everybody else, because that really does it reveals our own biases.
But the only thing that's kind of weird to me is the fact that the Muslim world did go into Persia and did go into Africa, but slavery doesn't seem to look the same way. It doesn't seem as though slavery was propagated through Persia.
It does, because we happen to, because by the time you get to the, sorry.
No, I was just going to say Coercion and all that region, I was just going to say like, I mean,
well,
the whole
history
of that, yeah.
So first of all, if you were to go to Nishapur in the 1000s, or Baghdad in 800, and you said slave, people would probably think of a Persian or a Turk.
Yes.
But a lot of Persians were enslaved. Okay? Persians, people speaking some kind of Persianate language. Second, those areas become Muslim, so you can't enslave from them anymore. Then you start slaving from Turkish areas. Then they become Muslim. You can't enslave from them anymore. So you have to go to other Turkish areas on the north of the Black Sea, or the Caucasus. Right, areas where there are like Christians in the Caucasus, like Georgia and Armenia. So by the time you get to the 1700s, the only place Muslims can go is sub-Saharan Africa. So it's more like, but if we were having this discussion 1,000 years ago, we'd all have totally different idea about what slavery meant, like who we were talking about. And by the way, then there's one of the main reasons that there's a really strong movement for abolition in Iran in the early 20th century is because Sunni Uzbeks in what's now Uzbekistan were raiding into Khorasan and Persia and enslaving Shiite Persians because they were saying they weren't Muslim. So Iranians were like really pissed off at their own government in the 1910s and 1920s because they weren't protecting them against enslavement by Sunni Uzbeks.
Can I quick follow up, just if you allow me? Can you juxtapose the usage of the term Adami in the Hadith to refer to a dark-skinned individual versus the Hadith هل عيرته بأمه أو ابن السوداء, for example?
So Adham or Adam? Adham or Adam?
Adam.
So the Hadith you're talking about. So there's two hadiths that are often conflated. One is in Sahih Bukhari, which talks about, what does it say? Oh my gosh, Abu Darda, I think it is, who says...
That's with a weak, it's weak that it's...
No, he says, I think it's Abu Darda, if I'm not mistaken. He says, I had my slave with him, and I insulted him, and when you insult somebody, you insult their mother, and then the slave is upset by that. It doesn't say the slave is African, it doesn't say the slave is Bilal. There's another hadith that's much less well known where it's Bilal who gets insulted. And then these two things get conflated. But either way, you're not allowed to insult the slave's ancestry, and in the other version, you're not allowed to insult someone, Bilal, for being black. Right? And then the Prophet, of course, says most famously in the hadith in Musnad Ahmad and Hanbal from the final sermon that the Arab has no virtue over the non-Arab, the red / i.e. white has no virtue over the black has no virtue except the taqwa. So I think that the prophetic condemnation of racism in the sense of judging someone by their race or judging them by their ancestry or engaging in any of this, like my group's better than you, is completely condemned. And as you know, when the Khawarij and the Aus start to argue, the Prophet comes out and he says something I don't think he says in any other hadith. He says, Hada muntin. I don't know of any other hadith where he says, muntin means this is putrid. Putrid. It's like disgusting rottenness. Like it is absolutely unacceptable. This, my group's better than your group. And Muslims should, I mean, I know it sounds like I'm being cheesy and preachy and stuff, but really do not accept other people saying things bad about another race, about another group of people. This is absolutely nonsense. You can say that cultures are different, but don't ever allow people to be judged by their skin color or by who they're descended from.
Inshallah, last two questions. This brother was first.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about reparations.
That's an interesting question. Not actually, I said in my book, like that's another issue which we'd have to talk about. I mean, reparations in the U.S., I feel pretty strongly about it. I mean, I think that there should be reparations to Native Americans and African Americans. But you know, it's funny. I only came to that conclusion based on my feelings on the Palestinian issue. So actually, if you'd asked me like 5 or 6 years ago reparations, I would have said I didn't agree with it. And that's just how much, like I was raised super white. Like I didn't really even meet any black people until I became Muslim, like African Americans. So, I mean, this is a good example of like really, I could not see this issue until I actually approached it from the Palestinian issue. So I think in the American context it's clear. The other question is, what about like, do Muslims owe reparations? That's such a hard question. I don't know. I've been trying to think about how to approach that issue. I know Joe Bradford, Sheikh Joe Bradford, he's Muslim. I don't know if you know, he's a very great scholar. He lives in Texas. He's, I think, written something about this online. I'm not sure what his conclusion was, but it would be an interesting place to start. Joe Bradford. His name is actually Joe. It's not Joseph. It's Joe.
I think one of the considerations for that would be comparing like Muslims to the American reparations consideration is the institutions that are related to the plight of black people to a degree are still in existence. Whereas within the Islamic world, who are you attributing that to? Are you attributing to a specific state, a specific tribe? It's a little bit more difficult to point a finger at institutions that may not exist in a similar or at all capacity 1,000 years later.
And another big issue is, if you look at some of the international kind of documents or declarations that have been made about reparations, like the Durban Declaration, I think, which was from 1998 or 2000, I can't remember exactly when it was from, but they state very explicitly that slavery was always a crime and was always morally wrong. But if you're not, like I as a Muslim, I'm not actually prepared to say that. I don't think that the slaves, that the prisoners that were taken by the Prophet during a certain battle and were enslaved, I don't think that was a moral wrong. I don't think that was illegal because I'm Muslim. And so at what point do you want to say this was illegal and immoral? Like prior to that, you wouldn't be able to there wouldn't be liability. So I think there's a lot of, but I think that's a fascinating question, and I have only my own immature thinking on it. But I think that's something that I would really like to think more about, because the second you start talking about reparation in the U.S., well, why not Muslims? Muslims have to have a way of addressing this topic. Yes?
I just want to go back to the topic of slavery and this whole notion of ownership. There's this idea of qisas, right? And if you kill your slave and you're not really, and you're the slave master, you're not really held accountable. You know,
well, you are.
And a lot of fiqh.
No.
And so I just want to know this idea of ownership, because everybody's an abd, right? At the end of the day, everybody's an abd. So why wouldn't there be qisas? Like ayn on ayn, like you know.
So because there's, this is a really interesting topic. I talk about it in my book. So the Prophet in one hadith says, "Man qatala abdu qatalnahu, man jada'a abdu jada'nahu, man ajda abdu ajda'nahu." Right? This is narrated by Al-Hasan al-Basri from Samura ibn Jundub from the Prophet. And Bukhari narrates it, but I don't think it's narrated in his Sahih, if I'm not mistaken. But he talks about it in his Tarikh al-Kabir. So this is interesting because it makes this principle that if you kill your slave, it's basically like you can be punished as if you killed any other person, right? But the madhabs don't take that position. They take the position that if you kill someone else's slave, in the Shafi, Hanbali, and Maliki school, you have to pay the person to value that slave. In the Hanafi school, there's no difference between a slave and a free person because that person's Adami. Like their Adamic humanity is what governs the situation. But even in the Hanafi school, if you kill your own slave, there's a different issue. Only some scholars took that hadith that I mentioned about the Prophet saying, if whoever kills a slave, we kill them. They take that and say, this is the principle we follow. But most of the schools take the position, rule from the Prophet and Umar bin al-Khattab, which is that if you kill your own slave, you don't get executed, but you do get exiled. You get 100 lashes and exiled for a year, and there's some other consequence as well. But that's the main ruling in the bad. So the reason why it becomes problematic is if you've taken the position that killing a slave isn't like killing a free person, therefore you can't be executed because you're a free person, you have to pay the value to that person's owner. If you kill your own slave, who do you pay the value to? So once you've taken that step, which everybody but the Hanafis did, now you're in a logic where it doesn't really make sense to be punished for killing your own slave because who are you going to pay the money to? But then there's this ruling from the Prophet and from Omar that the person is lashed 100 times and exiled for a year. So if you're interested in this, you can look in my book on slavery. I have a whole discussion on this topic.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming out. I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Brown.
My pleasure.
Another round of applause for Graylin Kimbrough.